All right, everybody. My co-chair has given me the signal to get started, so thank you, Jim. Thank you very much again for attending, for coming to the conference. We have one last panel. It's a really great one. I'm very excited. I've been waiting for it for quite a long time. And thank you for so many people for braving the cold weather and sticking around for a Saturday morning panel. This is actually an excellent turnout for Saturday morning. So
it's shocking.
It's shockingly good. So I know that you will definitely be rewarded with a great panel. We have a wonderful set of speakers and chair, VP of Policy Innovation and Competitiveness at the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, Mr. Eric Miller, who's also we're fortunate enough to have on our advisory board. Eric?
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm impressed that everybody got up and is here and all the rest of it. And so that puts a double obligation on us to make this interesting and make it worth your while to have been here. So we have a really interesting panel this morning. I would bet that many, or at least most of us, drove here, at least in full or in part, and that tells us, as we're all aware, of how important the transportation sector is to our future and what happens with energy in North America. And so we've got a pretty interesting group of diverse voices today on the North American auto industry. And so we've got Bob Lukfar, who is the co-owner and CEO of NatG CNG Solutions. He comes to us from Houston, Texas, where there's a little bit less snow than there is here. So we're not going to talk about winter and the relative impacts of that. But he's in a business which is really interesting and evolving, and that is the use of natural gas as a fuel alternative and how that plays. We also have Dan Malone from Butzel Long in Detroit. Dan does a lot of client work in Asia, and so is a really got an interesting view on how the transportation mix in Asia is evolving. They have, for example, massive congestion problems, and there's beginning to be this discussion about peak car. And Dan spends his time in Seoul and Beijing and other places where it takes an awful long time to go an awfully short distance, and we'll have views on how the transportation sector is evolving there. We also have Chris Sands, who I should say now the award-winning Chris Sands, who is known to all of us. Chris is imported from Detroit. Growing up in Detroit, he has had a long-standing interest in the North American auto industry and has been a very interesting and eloquent speaker on that particular front. And we also have Eric Marquis, who is the head of the Quebec office in Chicago. We're very excited to have him here because Quebec is taking some very interesting steps on electrification through Hydro-Quebec, and they've built a very interesting cluster in what some would see as vehicles of the future. And so we're going to make this a bit conversational. We're hoping that the speakers will disagree with each other. We're hoping that they'll question each other, because quite frankly, this is a very, very important topic. And so I think what I'll do is I'll start with Chris. Here we are now 5 or so years after the restructuring of the North American auto industry, and 5 or so years after President Obama really began to raise CAFE standards. So you first went to from 25.5 miles per gallon by 2016, and then you're going to 54.5 miles per gallon. All of that really started out of the auto crisis. And so just with government mandates alone, you're seeing this profound shift in vehicle technology. You've also seen, due to shifts in the energy picture, which we heard a lot about yesterday, a different impetus to do things in a new way within the transportation sector. So let me start off with Chris and say, where is the North American auto industry now, 5 or so years after the crisis? And particularly where is the Canada-US dimension of this? What we've seen is that Mexico now has a larger share of production in North America than Canada does. Should we be terrified about our future of the auto industry and what's really been the result over the last 5 years of fundamental transformation?
Well, that's a big question, lots to cover. Let me just say a couple of things there. I think while you can talk about the North American auto industry in the way we would here in Cleveland or in Detroit, in Washington, the North American auto industry is still predominantly GM, Ford, and Chrysler. And it's a kind of myopia that they have that focuses on the big three. We can still call them the big three, the big two, the Detroit three, not so big anymore. And at the same time as that becomes the focus, there is sometimes less attention to the innovation, the investment, the R&D activities of new entrant manufacturers. We probably even can't call them new entrants. They've been around for a long time, but I guess if we can call the new Democratic Party new and been new for a long time, we can still call them new entrants. But Toyota, Nissan, others are doing really good work here. Volkswagen, increasingly we're seeing a much broader footprint for the industry, not just here in the Midwest, but stretching further south. Our suppliers never get enough attention, in my view, as part of the policy mix. They're, to use the old cliche, where the rubber hits the road, where innovation's actually often applied. And I think the challenge first on the North American auto industry is figuring out what you're talking about. And I think we're too often in Washington, where I am, focusing on those Detroit three. The second challenge I think that comes with that is political. What we've seen in the last couple of iterations of auto crisis is Washington federal politicians looking for a quid pro quo. Yes, we'll come to your rescue with some sort of policy interventions that help the industry to do well against competition or against a bad economy. But what do we get for it in return? If we were having this conversation in 1950, it would be easy because everybody supported the auto industry because it was seen as such a central part of the economy. But it isn't in the same way. And so over the years, we've asked for lots of things from the auto companies that don't have to do with transportation. We've wanted the auto companies to pay a certain wage. We wanted them to be unionized. We wanted them to advance different causes. And now the big thing is we want them to advance green technologies. Now, to some extent, they do too, but we've used mandates to try to drive the industry in a direction that is more politically, I think, expedient than it is necessarily where the engineers themselves would send it. And so I think the problem of where we are in the auto industry today is too much politics, too much involvement of regulators. And while I respect the idea of setting out a mandate and leaving companies to figure out how to get there, that can be exciting. I think that it would be better if the industry responded to markets and consumers rather than trying to respond to political pressure in one way or another. And I say that it doesn't really matter whether it's this administration. I'm not being especially critical of this administration versus a future one. We've become habituated to government setting out targets, and often not coordinated targets between where the EPA would like to go or where NHTSA would like to go or where an individual congressional committee would like to go. So it's too political. That's where I think we are now. Now, that's not to say that good things aren't happening, but I think that's our biggest problem right now.
Great. So Dan, what are you seeing in Asia? Are they, so there's a lot of politics here and there's a lot of people running in a lot of different directions. And so there's been this big discussion about what is the technology future. Some thought it was plug-ins. The European companies would all like us to drive clean diesel because they've got big advantages there. And one of the ironies and one of the tensions in the auto industry is always between global platforms and regional platforms. And so as the industry undertakes this fundamental transportation, we're not knowing where we're going to go. Does the future look a little bit more like CNG? Does it look like electric? Does it look like fuel cells? Does it look like hydrogen? Does it look like really efficient internal combustion engines, sort of like we have now? What's your take? What's your take based on your experience in Asia about what they're seeing? China is now the largest auto market, so what they do will have an impact on North America, I suppose, or will it? And how do you see the future of auto mobility, and particularly with reference to the zero emission challenge playing out in that context and how it'll affect this context here in North America.
That's a lot to chew on. Let me begin by saying how much I appreciate participating in this morning's conversation. I think it's a particularly timely topic and one that is extremely important to our world. The initial question focused on the North American auto industry, but it's a bit of a misnomer to talk about the auto industry on a regional basis these days because of the global footprint that's been established by the principal players. The auto industry brings together an interplay of many considerations. The first of which is, in my opinion, transportation. And so it's actually larger than just automotive. And as Eric indicated, I spend a fair amount of time in Asia, and using Seoul, for example, the major roads in Seoul are absolutely traffic jammed all the time, notwithstanding the fact that their subway system transports more than 11 million passengers a day. And so when we talk about solutions, when we talk about trends, I think we need to broaden the discussion to transportation and not limit it just to automotive. When we talk about alternatives in terms of pursuing zero pollution level strategies and technologies, a lot depends on energy policies and what is going to be readily available as we move forward. Trade, obviously, is a hugely important consideration that needs to be taken into consideration as well. And as Chris mentioned, regulatory parameters are extremely important as well. I don't necessarily agree with what Chris said in two respects. One, that regulations are not necessarily beneficial. I do agree, of course, that too many regulations or burdensome regulations that are unnecessarily long and complicated and promote those who can interpret them best is not in the best interest, overall interests of the automotive industry. But I believe, and I'm going to use this legal term in a different way, but it really requires a public-private partnership in terms of formulating regulatory policy going forward. And historically, that's really not been the case between auto industries and the regulating governments. The global footprint that most large players, corporate players in the automotive segment, really contrasts with the traditional national, or let's call it siloed, approach that we take to regulations. So on the one hand, the regulated have gone global. The regulators remain local or national in scope. And so what I've really done is I've been quite involved, published a number of articles about regulatory harmonization and the trend, the movement that has gone on for at least 50 years now to try to harmonize or standardize regulations from one market to another. When done properly, it can have a host of very positive results. Now, getting to your question about Asia, when we talk about international trade, I mean, one of the most sort of popular topics these days are free trade agreements. Korea has really been one of the leaders in the area. China is in the throes of negotiating several free trade agreements. But the interesting thing is that the parties to particularly bilateral trade agreements are not necessarily on equal footing at the beginning of the negotiations, economically or otherwise. And so, like parties, countries go into these negotiations with a different set of wish list. And from Korea's standpoint, it has historically been known as the hermit kingdom, and it has had a very self-contained economy for quite a while. Parenthetically, it was based on export-driven manufacturing. so that most of the exports, in fact, most of the products manufactured were in fact exported, but Korea tended to be very protective of its own economy. So now along comes the EU, Korean Free Trade Agreement, the Chorus FTA, Canada, and others and actually China and South Korea are engaged in negotiations now for a free trade agreement. And I think the Koreans are determined to further expand their market penetration in the countries and the markets that they've negotiated with, while at the same time they want to make sure that being a little comma of a country that parenthetically many people in the West can't even find on a map, don't get completely flooded with imports. So in regard to technologies, I don't think that any particular technology has emerged in Korea or even China for that matter, although there's more and more push in China to essentially trend towards electric vehicles. So I could talk more, but I think I'll stop there.
No, we'll come back. I was very heartened to hear that you and Chris disagree with each other, which means we'll save the fireworks for
I only want to slightly disagree with his disagreement in the sense that
Yes.
It's not that I think we shouldn't regulate, but I think regulation for public safety, the traditional goal is there. Where we're not regulating is, as you're saying, to be for a global industry. I think there's too much politics in the regulation. It's not, and
Completely
that's
agree.
where I object.
Yeah,
So
yeah, the iterative process makes things unduly complicated, and special interests tend to come in and take a relatively straightforward regulation and turn it into something that you could teach an entire course on, and it benefits only those who have the financial wherewithal to modify the regulation to its particular needs.
They call that regulatory capture.
Well, let me
go to Bob, and
Okay.
we'll come back to this. So, Bob, you're an entrepreneur. You're engaged in what I think is one of the most interesting and transformative developments, and this brings the themes of yesterday, which looks at the natural gas revolution in North America, together with the themes from today. I'm not a huge watcher of talking head TV, but I would always enjoy T. Boone Pickens say, we need natural gas as a bridge fuel, and was very passionate in the run-up to the 2008 election and put a lot of money into this particular area. Now, lots of people have lots of opinions about energy, many of which are slightly off base or wrong. You're engaged in the actual process of trying to make that transformation happen of the automotive fleet. You told us when we talked before that you're working a lot with local governments, with fleets. How are you seeing the natural gas future in North America's transportation system? Are you seeing this is going to be a mass scale phenomenon? Are you expecting 3, 5, 7% market share for CNG vehicles in the future? Tell us from what you're seeing in this very exciting space, how you're seeing things evolve.
Sure. So let me try and sketch out briefly what's going on in natural gas vehicles, and start by saying I came from the energy industry. I'm a 25-year veteran of the energy industry. Mostly, I was head of strategy for BP's natural gas power business. Ran a number of different businesses along the way. So how did I get from energy to auto? We got from energy to auto because we looked out and saw this enormous price spread between the average BTU in a natural gas well and the average BTU on a refined product, and said it costs us $3 a gallon-ish for gasoline at a wholesale basis and 50 cents per gallon for a gasoline gallon equivalent in natural gas. And so if we've got $3 here and 50 cents here, and that spread looks pretty enduring, there must be something broken, because this ought to be happening already. Why aren't we running on natural gas, especially if we have some of the largest natural gas resources in the world? And so we went out and started looking around and asking that question. And the results of our questioning were pretty astonishing. First, we noted that the rest of the world has now produced and has on the road somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 million natural gas vehicles. And here in North America, we have about 150,000. Now, that doesn't seem quite right, especially when we're importing a significant chunk of our petroleum products and we're trying to export our excess natural gas. So why is that the state of affairs? Well, I think for a variety of reasons that I won't go into in great detail, except to say that our own supply chain and our own business in this area is very mature, and we saw an opportunity, and hence we opened up our business, NatG CNG Solutions, which is based in Texas. There are a variety of things that we think are advantageous about natural gas, starting with, the input fuel costs, even at retail, are about $1.50 a gallon less than what you're going to see on a typical transport fuel. For diesel, it's about $1.80. If you're here in Cleveland, I think the spread is more like $2.50 because your diesel prices here are pretty high. So there's a very, very significant economic benefit. There's also an environmental benefit. Typically, you're going to see a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. If you start dealing with older engines, you can see up to a 90% reduction in NOx and particulates. So there's a significant air quality environmental benefit. But the reason our customers do this is pure economics. I can cut 30 to 50% out of my fuel cost, and that matters a lot to somebody that makes their living by transporting things and driving. If I compare some of the advantages of natural gas vehicles, some of the alternative transportation, clean transportation technologies like electric vehicles. And let me just start by saying I like electric vehicles. I drive a Chevy Volt along with my natural gas Silverado. So I like the electric vehicles quite a lot. But when you compare the two, natural gas is a great application for high horsepower, high torque engines, which you can't get at the moment out of batteries. The storage medium for natural gas costs about $130 to $150 per gasoline gallon equivalent. A storage medium for batteries is about $3,000 to $7,000 per gasoline gallon equivalent. So we're getting much better energy density. If we look at the energy density per cubic foot, we're getting about 5 times the energy density per cubic foot with natural gas than we do if we're going electric. And maybe most important, and if there's nothing you take away from my little talk here today other than this, it's natural gas can apply to the installed base of vehicles, not just new vehicles. You can transform or convert in the installed base relatively simply, relatively cheaply.
So I got a Ford Escape 2010. If I want to go to CNG, give me a.
So if we look at the Ford Escape, you can't do because we don't focus on the little cars, because that's not where the market is. If you've got an F-150 or something heavier than that, we've probably got a solution for it. An F-150, F-250, a Silverado, an Isuzu, a Caterpillar C15, 15-liter engine. We've got solutions for all of that, because that's where the economic case is made most compelling. Right. So we focus on fleets, we focus on vehicles that are traveling, 50,000 miles a year, 25,000 miles a year on light duty, and because that's where the economics are, that's where the money is, and you can get a solution for almost all of that stuff. If you want to find a solution for your Ford Focus, for your Ford Escape, for something similar, natural gas isn't there, because your market isn't big enough yet to make it interesting.
Is it not there yet?
It's not there yet, and it's not for any technical reason. It's just because the economics don't support us developing a system for it. Developing a system is a relatively straightforward matter. We just developed a system for the 2.4-liter GM small SUV. It took us about 8 months to develop the system and get it through EPA testing. So it's relatively straightforward. It's just that there's not a market there for it.
And basically, you've got you go with the bigger vehicles because the cost savings are much more dramatic, which pays off the transformation faster.
And what I would say is the most of the vehicles that we do are what we would call biofuel vehicles. For a gasoline engine, we're going to add CNG to the vehicle, and it's going to be able to run on both gasoline and natural gas. On on diesels, we're doing a blended fuel technology. And again, the blended fuel technology, which is known as dual fuel, idiotically enough, but it's blended fuel technology. What it does is displace diesel BTUs with natural gas BTUs. And the computer controls how much diesel, how much natural gas. The relevant thing to take away from that is if you run out of natural gas, you can still drive on diesel. If you run out of gasoline, you can still, or run out of natural gas, you can still drive on gasoline. So we're not tied to a national infrastructure to make it work. And that's the big change that we're seeing in natural gas vehicles, are these multi-fuel solutions that make it much more broadly applicable for many more companies and fleets.
That's-
And
yeah.
I'll probably hold there and we can come back.
That's very exciting. Eric, you know, I'm not going to ask you to handicap the election on Monday, but.
We'd like to hear that.
Well, he can answer it any way he wants, including taking a nice diversion around. But one of the things you've seen, Quebec has really built itself into a leader in the electric vehicle space. And one of the things that I think has been so exciting about this time is how many new players are coming into the industry. How many new, as you get this great technological shift, you've had Hydro-Quebec, the big utility in Quebec that's really shown a leadership role in this particular space. You've got this cluster in Quebec now with over 60 companies. You're also, because you've got a big utility which has decided to carry this particular process, you're getting a real focus on electrifying the infrastructure within Quebec, which is a great challenge. I mean, part of what Bob's offering is a solution which doesn't depend on putting millions and millions of dollars of new established infrastructure in place. Can you give us a vision of how, from a Quebec perspective, you're looking at the electric future of the vehicle, and what have been some of the governments, what have been some of the investments on this, and some of what's the politics around this particular scenario?
Well, first, I guess I would qualify my answer by saying that at the start, I'm not necessarily an energy specialist, an automotive specialist. I'm not even an award-winning so this is really more I guess a civil servant's perspective, a generalist perspective on this issue, and it's an issue that's been quite exciting in Quebec in recent years, because I fully hear the comment that Chris made about politics being such a major influence, and not always constructive, in the regulatory process. And to make a quick tie into the election campaign, I'm sure some of you have been following that campaign. We're in the final stages. Election day is on the 7th. And let's just say the campaign has been marked by a lot of spirited debates on a host of issues.
That's a very good civil service answer.
To the extent that one could be really hard-pressed to find one issue of one area of common ground between the different parties, including those that could aspire to form a government. Well, it seems we have one, and it's electric transportation. So that's, I think that's one of the, I think if we look at the last two governments, I mean the Liberal government of Mr. Charest had unveiled the electric transportation policy. The current government of the Parti Québécois went along the same way, and I mean, from what Mr. Philippe Couillard mentioned this week, if the Liberals win the election in a couple of days, electric transportation will remain a major priority. So I think that's a case in which politics will not get in the way, and instead could act as to spur innovation and job creation. We'll put it that way. Why is this so? I think the first thing is clearly, and Eric mentioned it quite clearly, is the strength of our hydroelectric sector as a source of clean and reliable power. Corollary to that, Clearly, there's the emergence of shale gas in the U.S., combined to the development of hydroelectric capacity in Quebec, such as La Romaine project and other projects that could be developed in the coming years, such as Gros-Mécatina, are going to generate significant hydroelectric surpluses. So how do we leverage that? Thirdly, thanks to hydropower, I think we've had a very strong record in curbing greenhouse gas emissions. However, a key area of concern remains transportation of individuals and goods. I think the transportation sector, in terms of greenhouse gas emission in Quebec, it represents about 43% of all emissions. So that's an area where progress, I think, could be achieved. And I think as with any significant environmental initiative, success rests in a large part on public sector engagement and having a strong private sector involvement. What's the economic case for the sector? What's the business case for the sector? And in that regard, I think there's been in recent years the development of a strong electric transportation cluster in Quebec. I'll mention a few of the companies in a few minutes, consisting both of private companies and research centers. And many of these companies and research centers are actually involved in international collaborations, such as some of the things that Hydro-Quebec did with Mitsubishi, for instance, in recent years. And also, I think we got to keep in mind that clearly Quebec does not have an auto industry of the magnitude of that of Ontario, Michigan, and Ohio, and other American states. But we tend to forget that the automotive sector is a significant job creator in Quebec, so there's that there are several companies that are part of the value chain. And clearly, there's Hydro-Quebec as one of the key marginal resources. So I'm not going to get into the entire details of the various approaches that have been, policies that have been put forward by both the Charest and the Marois government, and that are, I think, going to be a part of. I mean, we're really thinking long term and for the next 15 or 20 years here. I think we're thinking in terms of significantly increasing the number of vehicles under some form of electric power. If you look at one strategy, it was 25% by 2020. I mean, the PQ went more for a number, like it was something like 13,000 vehicles by 2017, which I guess.
I think one of the things that's interesting here, though, is that what's happening in Quebec and what's happening in Texas actually are the same process. Quebec, La Romaine, correct me if I'm wrong, but when my CEO talked to the CEO of Hydro-Quebec, he told him that La Romaine is the largest infrastructure project in the world currently under construction. So you imagine it's Three Gorges Dam or Four Gorges Dam now in China or somewhere like that, but it's actually in the wilds of northern Quebec. And what you have is this massive addition of electric capacity, which means that the price of electricity is going to get a whole lot cheaper, even putting aside the cleaner bit. What you've had in Texas with Eagle Ford, and then some of what you can buy on the national markets coming out of Marcellus and Utica and Bakken and so on, is an amazing surge in supply of natural gas. And so in essence, you're looking at two different jurisdictions that are responding to the same phenomenon. We got big spread between conventional fuels and what you can buy.
Yeah. But just to keep going on this, I think there's so in terms of priority areas, as I mentioned, rapidly increasing the use of public transportation, develop and consolidate research capacity, strong and productive industrial network, and I think what's the key to all this is really it's going to be a priority of the next Quebec government, no matter what. I think we can all read the polls and see what is likely to happen, but I think that's it will remain a priority of the government. And Hydro-Quebec is huge in this, and clearly La Romaine, and it's not being from the North Shore region of Quebec. It's not too much in the wild. It's remote, but it's not too wild. But you can't. Just kidding. But Gros-Mécatina would be particular there. There's at this current time, there's no roads in that sector. So that would be a big undertaking.
Not too remote. My wife who's here is a big fan of ice road truckers, so I think there'll be some of that.
And if you look at companies, and I think because clearly Hydro-Quebec is a key player, but you look at partners in this project. Just for the partner, the project of the electric bus, for instance. You got Nova Bus that's involved. You got Bathroom Canada for the batteries, TM4 for the electric engine system, and several others for composites, intelligent transfer system, design and engineering. If you look at companies for the project as a whole, I mean, you got players like Bombardier, CEE, Canada Lithium, Alcoa, GE. So we're Rolls-Royce Canada, Siemens, Aerodeftek, Pratt & Whitney, Hydro-Quebec, and its Electricity Relay Research Institute. So we're not. So there's quite a bit of momentum. There's quite a bit of interest, and these are really serious groups and economic actors that are going to provide private sector impetus to that.
Sure. So one of the things that there's always a lot of discussion on in the future of the auto industry, particularly in its transformation, is what should be the role of government. Those who are in the natural gas business tend to be very proud of the fact that this has largely been a private sector developed phenomenon. When you look at the profiles even of the established OEMs, and Chris mentioned some of what's going on with Nissan, with the Leaf in Tennessee, and when you look at what's gone on with GM and the Volt, and you go down the list, there's a huge amount of private sector development. On the other hand, and we can put aside the emergency funds for restructuring GM and Chrysler, there's also been a huge amount of U.S. government investment that's gone into transportation futures, and certainly in Quebec, you've seen this as a public-private partnership. What should be, is there an optimal model for government engagement in the industry? You get too much of it, you get that regulatory capture problem of governments trying to say, no, you shall do electric. So why don't we start with Bob? Why don't I throw it to you to start and give us the view from your vantage?
Sure. Let me share two thoughts with you on this. First, if we look at, there's about 200,000 round numbers, about 200,000 electric vehicles that have been put on the road, and they'll displace around 100 million gallons of fuel this year. There, as I mentioned earlier, about 140,000 natural gas vehicles that are on the road, and they will displace about 800 million gallons of fuel this year. Now, why? Because natural gas is going into much, much bigger fuel consumers. And so your bang for your buck on natural gas in terms of fuel displacement is about 8x if you look at a typical vehicle. Now, there's a myth around the natural gas industry that electric gets all of these subsidies and natural gas doesn't. That's false. In fact, in a number of states, we see state-level incentives to build infrastructure, for example, in Oklahoma, to even build vehicles. We see that in places like Louisiana and in Oklahoma. So those government actions have helped spur the industry, but at a much smaller scale. Those small incentives are important. The most important thing from our perspective is getting fast-tracking processes through the EPA so that we can get certified systems on the road more cost-effectively and more quickly. And that's the single biggest thing, and there's been a change in that, which again, I won't drag you through, but there's been a change in that in the last 2 years that now makes it much, much, much easier for me to get a new system on the road, and that has been the single biggest change that will help facilitate this.
So you've actually seen big improvement.
We've seen a significant improvement. We've seen less significant improvement with respect to the posture of OEMs on this, but right. With respect to government, we've seen a big improvement and a pretty positive move.
Dan, go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to say this. I mean, I think that one of the things that you're hearing from people in the industry, from both of our guys here, which I think is important, is that they're looking at systems that have multiple fuel options, cars that can do a couple of things. And gasoline, natural gas, electricity, it's all a commodity. Prices are going to go up and go down. It's very exciting to say, how do we use cheap electricity or cheap natural gas now, but nothing stays cheap forever. And giving the consumer the flexibility to kind of adjust so that their pocketbook doesn't take a hit every time you see a change, I think is an important thing that government can be, encouraging. Where I think governments have sometimes erred is in getting so excited about something that they try to pick a winner. Cellulosic ethanol, if we just get behind this, it'll become a big thing, without saying instead what we want is a certain amount of bio or renewable fuel, and just kind of leaving it to industry to figure out how to do it. Because the ingenuity is much more on the private side. I think government oversteps if it tries to micromanage that innovation. But where they can, through regulation, enable and empower innovation, bringing it to market quickly, safely, of course, but bringing it quickly, I think they do more than when they try to pick a winner or get really infatuated with one solution, which never lasts.
So Dan, one of the common complaints on this role of government issue that you hear, and certainly Ford and others have talked about this with respect to trade agreements, is the Koreans and others are protecting their market, the Koreans and others are subsidizing it, the government is blocking distribution. From the point of view of seeing North America as an export market, and incidentally, this is another exciting shift that you've seen. So you take the Ford plant at Oakville, where it used to be the Ford plant at Oakville would ship stuff to the US and across Canada. Now they're shipping stuff to China and Brazil from there. So you're starting to see North American auto plants as global platforms. But the complaint you get in terms of markets like Korea is that the government is meddling and is keeping imports out and benefiting local producers. How do you see this question of what the role of government should be in North America from your vantage point in Asia? Because clearly, even you take something like Hyundai and Kia, which is now 10% of the market in Canada, they get an awful lot of benefit from not having an awful lot of competition in the home market.
Yes, they do. Well, there's, again, a lot to cover. First of all, I think the role of government was, is, and always will be essential to an industry like automotive. Totally agree with what Chris said, and I don't think, even though government can be a tremendous source of resources for developing differentiating technology, I think it really should restrain itself from trying to select winners among competing technologies and allow the experts in the private sector, in the industry, to, for lack of a better term, research and even experiment with competing technologies, and let the market allow which technology or technologies will emerge as the eventual winners. In regard to trade, there is a direct interplay between non-tariff barriers that countries use and robust trade between countries or among countries. I don't want to pick on Korea. I happen to be very fond of Korea, but
feel free. It's a friendly audience.
But yeah, I mean, there are certainly examples and prior to the Chorus FTA and the EU FTA, et cetera, where Korean administrative impediments effectively closed the market to imports. The number of vehicles that were sold, foreign-made vehicles sold in Korea, traditionally topped out at about 2% market share collectively. And even though there have been some modest gains, there still is a long way to go to open that market as, I would say, the term open is traditionally defined. But there's some really interesting things, and I want to just go off on a little bit of a tangent of a term you used at the front, peak auto. Yeah. And if you talk about the United States market, I mean, some would argue that peak auto is in sight. But when you broaden to the global level, we're not even close to peak auto. And that's something that really needs to be considered as we go forward. It took 110 years for the auto industry to reach the 1 billion vehicles on the road mark, and that was achieved in 2010. A lot of experts, Chris, I'd be interested in your thoughts, predict that by 2040, we will have 2 billion vehicles on the roads globally. The vast, vast majority of that growth is going to occur outside the United States, outside of North America. And so it's going to be very, very important to understand what the ground rules are. And that's what I typically refer to as regulations going forward. As briefly as I can make it, there's been a very interesting global regulatory history with harmonization since the end of World War II. And in an effort to try to rebuild Europe, there were very concerted efforts to try to break down some of the regulatory barriers or differences among Western European countries. And so for the past 60 years, the regulatory harmonization efforts in that part of the world have been refined quite extensively. It's typically referred to as the 1958 agreement. The United States and Canada sat by because it could not participate in that agreement because of things known as type approval, which is a certification process the U.S. does not subscribe to, mutuality of recognition, basically saying if a product is certified in one of the participating nations, in effect, it can be exported and sold in all other competing markets as well. And so in a very real sense, there's an intellectual battle going on in terms of what should be the regulatory grid globally as we move forward. And my concern is that if we don't take a more aggressive approach, we meaning the United States and Canada, we could find particularly our suppliers, effectively closed out of the most growth-oriented markets in the world. In 1998, after watching the 58 agreement for 40 years, the United States, Japan, Canada, and many others created what's known as the 1998 agreement in the United Nations European Economic Commission. And it has moved forward, it has made some progress, but it is, in my opinion, quite a distance behind the 58 agreement. And so unbeknownst to a lot of people, even in the auto industry, there is this intellectual battle going on in terms of which of the two agreements should prevail.
So let me press you on that a little bit. So for Bob's guys or for Eric's guys, is there, with this emergence of all this new technology, clearly there's different regulatory frameworks that are cropping up on that. So if Bob gets to the point where he wants to take his technologies or his processes to India or to South Africa or some other fast-growing region of the world where they might have an interest in large, high-powered vehicles with lower emissions, what's the regulatory environment look like out there, and are there new obstacles that are being put in place now for protectionist or other reasons?
To be clear, the problem is the other way around.
Yeah.
We have really good technologies in India and Pakistan and Singapore that we can't get into North America because of regulatory barriers.
So talk about that.
Because these guys have 18 million trucks on the road and we have 140,000 because we can't figure out how to do it and they can. And so, you know, if you bring us, you can use a natural gas cylinder anywhere in the world except in America where you have to get it recertified as a DOT certified and it's a different set of standards. You can use a natural gas system, which we know is going to have lower emissions, but you have to go through a separate EPA evaluation in the U.S. to bring it into the U.S. And you know it's going to cost you $400,000 or $500,000 in best case, $1 million probably in a more typical case to certify a new vehicle. And how many new vehicles do you have to sell to cover off $1 million in investment in a regulatory scheme for the same vehicle that can already be done? We just did a Cummins 15-liter engine. It's going to get a 30% reduction in NOx, a 50% reduction in fuel consumption. It's been running on the road in Mexico for years. We're going to go through an entire 6-month EPA process to get it running on the road in the United States. So the irony here is the innovation's happening outside of North America, and we're having a hard time pulling it in.
So
we're having to reinvent stuff.
So how do you? So what is it that? so is this an express approval process from EPA? Are there other, what do you
There are
what do
two-
you
there
do
are
about this?
Two problems. One is an express approval process, which is on the books. The biggest problem we have right now, it all depends on your basis for comparison, right? Compared to 3 years ago, the express approval process is vastly better, so we're so very grateful for that. At the same time, all of the EPA is considered non-essential, and so they're still furloughing 1 day a week because of budget constraints, and we've got shortage of people that can do this stuff. So they've got a 6-month backlog.
So you'll be the,
The whole industry is backlogged 6 months now, trying to bring new product to market because we don't have enough folks to do these evaluations.
Well, and let me pick up on that, because I think this is one of the things that we need to think about, which is the role of government in doing this kind of work. There are backlogs in other areas in terms of crash testing and so on. And when we talk about a Canada-US challenge, I think there are two things we ought to do. One is publish standards. Government should have the standards out there, but many of them are engineering standards. If a Canadian regulator crashes the cars and says, okay, we got these results, and they actually meet the Canadian standards and the American standards, even if they're not exactly the same, I think the US should take that report from the Canadian the Canadian testers and say, it's good enough for us because we trust the Canadians and they do a good job.
Right. That's not likely currently.
Oh, I know,
Right.
but I think we can, what I'm
Right.
saying is I think that this is a way that government, which is having a capacity issue, and because of furloughs, there's not a lot of more money for more equipment, et cetera, to necessarily be able to expand that capacity, so why don't we lean on the capacity of a trusted ally? I would go one step further. One thing that I think the Europeans have done very well, is they've empowered a private sector lab industry, I guess,
Yeah.
with labs that are German and Dutch and Danish that will do the testing. They're certified by the government, make sure that they don't cook the books, and then they do the testing on new products, report back to the regulators who say, yes, we find this fine, they do occasional audits. But that creates STEM jobs. It puts the private sector in a position to raise the capital for the best equipment to do the testing quickly and to provide not $1 million clearance, but they'll try to save money for their clients so they get more business. I think we could do much more of that in North America, not taking away the regulators' setting of the rules, but taking away some of the burden on them to actually do inspection and compliance so we can lower compliance costs across the board.
I would supplement your comments, Chris, with two others. There's a program, and I know the acronym, but I can't tell you what it stands for, in Europe that has been going on for many years called CARS 21. It's now been in its third generation called CARS 2020. And essentially what it is a think tank consisting of government representatives and private sector folks who are working collaboratively on very, very sophisticated regulations for new technologies. As you know, technologies are emerging more rapidly than ever through computer-assisted research and whatnot, and it's very difficult for the regulators to keep up. And so what they've done is essentially changed the paradigm, and they're working more collaboratively, more so, in my opinion, than we do in the United States or, as I understand it, Canada. Back in the mid-'60s, the U.S. Congress passed the Vehicle Safety Act of 1966, and out of it arose the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the EPA. And the enabling legislation and the discussions, the comments to that legislation clearly contemplated that the government and the private sector would be working collaboratively towards improving highway safety. As a result of things unfolding perhaps a little bit more awkwardly than they should have, the relationship between NHTSA and the regulated industry has become much more strained and even acrimonious at times. Clearly there is a role for a regulator to be aggressive in enforcing regulations. But there must and should be another component to this relationship, which is both short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning for what's in the best interest of the industry as opposed to a particular company or the government.
So let me go to Eric here. So so in terms of this initiative or this process that's ongoing in Quebec, are you seeing this, or is Hydro-Quebec seeing this as a kind of export development play, or is this mostly focused on how do we get people living in the province of Quebec into electric vehicles? How do we get fleet vehicles that are carrying things around in Montreal electrified? Because I guess presumably if you got the technology and you get some deployment in your jurisdiction, you'll want to move to exporting. Is there some sense of concern about how the regulatory environment in other parts of North America and other parts of the world are affecting the development of the electric space?
I think most definitely, clearly as is usually the case in government policies, there's a domestic impact that has to be first considered. But if you build an industry, if you build an industrial cluster that is world-class, clearly it's for developing also export capacity, and whether it's export capacity, whether it's export international research partnerships, and or even like investment in other markets. So I mean so clearly there is going to be a concern about that. I'd like to maybe just make a quick point in terms of also regional harmonization, because sometimes when people governments start developing like okay, we want to do work on alternative fuel, we want to do work on electric cars, and clearly if you've got competing and at times contradictory sets of regulations from one jurisdiction to another, that usually doesn't lead to outstandingly successful results. So I think there's something that last summer, on a more immediate regional basis, there's the Eastern Canadian premiers and New England governors met in L'Amalbaie, and they adopted a couple of resolutions on those issues, which I think lead towards having a shared regulatory or shared environment in that regard. And one of the resolutions is actually on something very basic on ensure the development and the interoperability of all the EV charging stations, and the alternative refueling infrastructure.
Yeah.
So another one is going to be simply to work on prioritizing which will be the road corridors. There's one that's starting now between Montreal and Burlington, but other maritime provinces or New England states have an interest. So how to prioritize what are the key road corridors to be developed, and also shared strategies in terms of attaining a 5% fleet market share in terms of alternative fuel vehicles. I think that's for the entire region. I think what it means, and I think, and this is a reasoning that can apply to a host of what I would call binational regional issues. I mean, you just look at, I don't know, something like even ballast water on the Great Lakes St. Lawrence. I mean, if you have states and provinces with competing regulations,
right.
Again, I mean, that's...
I would submit that somebody like, the state of New York would have a hard time keeping that ballast water in the same.
Well, we'll let their representatives answer that.
I'm just using them as an example. So, Bob, on the market side, you've talked about this. You've talked about the spread. One of the big debates that's happening in the U.S. is about to what extent natural gas should be exported. You've got the Cheniere terminal in Louisiana, which has been converted to an export terminal. I think there's 7 that have been approved and another 5 that are proposed. And so America is going to become a natural gas exporting superpower. This is also having some interesting effects north of the border, where Canada, which had had the U.S. as basically a huge buyer for a long time, is now going to need to look at other places. There's been some discussions with people in India about taking East Coast Canadian natural gas. So you have the dynamic on the export side. Certainly, having all of that natural gas in North America helps to depress the price. Are you worried that the spread is going to narrow enough that it will impact adoption of CNG in the transportation space?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, but let me give you the slightly longer answer. The first thing is to just recognize the absurdity of what we're talking about here, right? So if we really stopped and stepped back and looked at what's going on and said, here, I've got a great idea for you. I'm going to continue to import energy at $100 a barrel. And I'm going to take my domestic energy, which, by the way, would give me significant environmental benefits. I'm going to liquefy it. I'm going to shoot it out across the ocean the other direction because I don't want to use it in my transportation sector, and I'll sell that for $30 a barrel. What a great idea. You'd say, you're an idiot. Why would you do that? And the answer is, well, I shouldn't do that. But I'm doing that because that's how our transportation sector has grown up to date. So, will it affect natural gas into the transportation sector? Probably not. And here's why. At $4 an MMBTU, natural gas costs, again, good number to run, roughly divide by 8, right? So you can say it's 50 cents a gallon. So if I take, and that's our wholesale price, if I take that price and double it, which won't happen under any scenario, and go to $8 an MMBTU, I'm at $1 a gallon. So the spread continues to be there. Really what happens when you put natural gas into vehicles is you're taking what's mostly commodity price and turning it into a capital cost, because the cost at the pump is mostly the cost of putting in the pump, putting in the compressor, transporting it through a pipeline, that sort of stuff. So as a result, what you're seeing is that you've got a much more stable pump price with natural gas than what you do with gasoline. So I don't think, the only thing that will really impact is if we see a crash in oil prices. Other than a crash in oil prices, I think that spread will be enduring. But again, the prima facie story there is, this is crazy. Why would you go freeze natural gas and ship it to China and then continue to import 35% of your oil from overseas?
So in 10 or 15 years, what you're thinking in terms of the breakdown of CNG vehicles in the fleet in the United States?
We have no idea. It depends on, like, if you buy a car today, it goes off the road in 2036, right? Typical vehicle truck is going to be on the road for 22 years.
Right.
Average age of the fleet 11.4 years. So the key question is, what do people do with the installed base? You know, if we wait for new vehicles, this transformation, we'll be talking about this in somebody will be talking about this in 2040.
If I were a consultant, I'd be happy about that.
Absolutely. But I think if like everywhere else in the world, we see a big movement in the installed base, we could see penetration that vastly exceeds anybody's expectations, because we can start moving 10, 15, 20% of our fleet that's already out there to natural gas with systems that are already on the market.
Yeah.
Well, and let me add to that, because one of the things that you can do now, it's not hugely difficult, is you can substitute for corn-based ethanol. You can make ethanol out of natural gas, and we've got the Coscata plant in Illinois. There's some work that's been done in Texas on this, and it's a way of increasing the natural gas content of the fuel that we're using, even if you're not a big truck. I mean, we're talking about a solution for your Ford Escape or something like that, where we have ethanol in fuel for a reason. It's a knock, and it's good to have it. So we could do that. Now we also have
an expensive way to use natural gas in fuel, though, right?
But it is a way, and especially if your alternative is rising prices on ethanol, then it's not a bad substitute when the price works. And I'm not saying mandate anything, just see where the price goes. The other option, which has been discussed, and we have a certain number, 1.4 million flexible fuel vehicles on the road. And this is, again, a solution for the small side, where you say, well, it can run on blends of gasoline, ethanol, methanol, and we let the market figure out what's available, so that consumers say, depending on price spikes, can say, okay, well, why don't we use more of the natural gas that we have as part of the ethanol that goes into our fuel. So I think that in terms of the regulators, now coming back to the state, there's a lot that technology can do to take advantage of abundant supply of natural gas in the transportation sector. And we need to be much more open on the regulatory side to letting that happen and letting the market and giving consumers choice so that they can ride out commodity price cycles and all of the variations that you were suggesting in terms of scenarios.
Yeah. So who are the big players in the auto industry in 10 to 15 years? I mean, one of the things you see is you have jurisdictions like Quebec that have done some very interesting things. You've got some fascinating stuff in Texas that's going on. Go into the world of infotainment systems. When Ford did the first generation Sync, they had a partnership with 30 different companies. You have a whole lot of different players that are coming into the space. And this goes back to Chris's first point about the politics of the industry. Do the Detroit Three continue to own this? And then let me throw another dimension on top of that in terms of driverless vehicles. So how does the supply chain look different, and how does the technology mix look different? Because it strikes me that basically you're talking about empowering consumers to make intelligent choices on energy in the vehicle space and on other things in the vehicle space. So basically, my iPhone becomes my way of controlling my transportation future, and that has all sorts of ramifications in terms of where the suppliers are, who they are, what happens. So look out 10 or 15 years, Dan, and tell us what you see in terms of how does this industry look?
Well, the auto industry is obviously in a continual state of evolution. And I think before we look forward, we look back briefly, and the relationship has changed between the Detroit Three and its supply chain. More and more, the industry is set up so that the suppliers are really on the cutting edge of differentiating technology. And they then, in effect, shop the new technology to the customer vehicle manufacturers. And so some of the suppliers are some of the largest companies in the world, and probably every bit as influential as the Detroit Three themselves. I think that trend is going to increase exponentially because of what causes people to purchase vehicles. And there was a time when, you know, the engine capacity or the things that were directly related to vehicle performance was the determinant. But more and more, differentiating technology in comfort and in safety are really the determinants of why a consumer buys one product versus another. If taken to its logical extreme, and your comment about infotainment is right on, then when you talk about the US-Canada conference in 20 years, the Detroit Three could conceivably be Google and IBM and Microsoft, or companies that haven't even been created yet. And essentially what they do is they put together their, not vehicle, but infotainment center on wheels, their mobile living center, and then simply buy a badge to put on, you know, the completely constructed car by its supply chain. That's at least conceivable. I'm not predicting that's what's going to happen, but I'm absolutely certain that companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft are going to play a huge role. And those are not companies that are typically associated with the automotive industry per se.
So is it like it's like cell phones? It doesn't matter if they're made in Korea or Taiwan. It's the software that really becomes the brand.
Oh, I think so.
Like
and
Apples and Samsungs and Android.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing.
The automakers, because their revenue generation is projected on sales, want people, when there's a new and improved technological advancement, you know, that's available in the model year 2014, and you've got a 2013, go out and buy a new car. What I see coming is something analogous to, let's call it a CD player, where you open up the tray and there's room for 5 CDs. And these CDs are in effect the brains for running the infotainment center or the safety components or whatever feature it may be for the vehicle. What we may end up morphing towards is buying a new set of CDs that you can pull the 2013 models out and put the 2014 out, and now you've got yourself an upgraded vehicle. The vehicle manufacturers would not support that at all, understandably.
It would
But-
be ironic if Apple got into doing CDs, considering they
Right,
killed
right.
the
Well,
CD.
that's true, that's true. But that concept, you know, in terms of what lies ahead, can have a very dramatic shift in where the industry goes. And all I'm suggesting is not that that's the way it's going to be in fact, but when we consider what the possibilities are, it's an industry that's really on the front edge of some very, very exciting developments. One other comment, I just want to.
And I want to move to some questions
Okay, sorry.
from the audience. And
Sorry.
I saw that Jim was trying to get my attention, and we've got Ross and a few others. So,
Thanks very much, Eric. Bob, I seem to recall, maybe I'm wrong, that back in the late 80s and early 90s, Canadian Hunter tried to get into natural gas for vehicles. They put a hell of an effort into it and finally gave up. And one of the reasons, I think, was that they couldn't get enough stations along the roads to dispense it. And I don't know whether that's going to be a drawback to what I thought was a terrific idea at that time and has not ever come about in a significant way.
That's right. So we've gone down this road before, and you know, rolled into our facility maybe a month ago, a 1998 Crown Victoria from Ford that was running on natural gas. Still running on natural gas, if you're happy to know. The problem is that there was no infrastructure. Today we've got 1,400 stations, public stations in the U.S. That's up 300 facilities from the year before. So in some respects, the change that's happening here is that we are seeing a dramatic growth in infrastructure. The second thing we're doing, and NatG is in this business of building private fueling stations. We've got now much lower cost private fueling packages for fleets. So we can drop a station for a mid-sized fleet on their facility for $190,000, $200,000, and they can fuel at home, and they fuel at their fleet site for, you know, $1.20, $1.30 a gallon. Again, it's a fleet business right now, but as the fleets are growing, we're also seeing public infrastructure grow. So we think the tipping point on public infrastructure, and we've seen a dramatic increase. It's still, you know, there are 4, 5, 6 if you count the planned stations in Cleveland, so it's not like you're going to have one on every corner. But it's also the case if you're driving a natural gas vehicle in Cleveland, you can find one. The second point is this multi-fuel point, which is almost everything we're building today is a multi-fuel vehicle. So on a bad day, you're running on gasoline, which is where you started. And just make one other point on the one thing we know for sure is going to change in the auto sector going forward is it used to be the case if you bought a vehicle in 2007, you bought a Chevy Tahoe, most of the economic cost of that vehicle went to the energy company. It wasn't the price of the vehicle. If you looked at the life cycle cost, most went to the energy company, the oil company that was providing your fuel. Today, that's no longer the case. And the share of life cycle vehicle cost that's going to energy companies has gone from the largest share to the second largest share, and it will now continue to decline. And so we would have spent $30,000 on the Tahoe, $35,000 on fuel. Today, you'd spend $30,000 on a Tahoe. If you bought a natural gas Tahoe, you'd be spending $15,000 on fuel. So that change is dramatic, and it's going to continue. The energy companies are becoming less less the driver, forgive the pun, of
Yeah.
of the overall life cycle cost of the vehicle.
Great
And
point.
the thing I would just also add that we're gonna have to watch is that natural gas is purchased by a lot of residential consumers in a rate-regulated environment because of a public utility that has a monopoly. Commercial customers, on the other hand, can buy, basically as commercial customers straight from producers. And when consumers are filling up their tank with compressed natural gas, are they gonna buy it at the rate-regulated rate, or are they going to get it from a vendor who maybe has a different pricing and tax environment? So I think that's an important question to ask, how we're gonna distribute gas.
Governor.
And you have competition to keep the price down for the consumer.
Exactly.
Quick question and comment. My comment. The biggest fan of CNG vehicles is Sergio Marchionne, the chairman and CEO of Chrysler Fiat. And I don't know whether I assume you've talked to him, but I think they're one of the largest producers of gas vehicles in Europe. And he believes what you've said, he believes it's an absolute, for most places, no-brainer to have CNG vehicles in the U.S. You could easily convert a fleet. He even goes so far as to say, like in Michigan, with 80% of the homes are heated by natural gas, you actually could have a natural gas hookup right in your garage as part of the infrastructure. So I'm really following what you've said with great interest. I'm also aware, having served in Canada, about the enormous potential of hydropower and hydroelectric. It's just unbelievable. It gives you a lot of luxuries to regulate everything else out of existence, I might add. But this is a wonderful panel. I guess my question is, I've given you my speech, is I assume that you all agree that the two things we need are reasonable regulations which can be implemented in a timely fashion, meaning timely permits. And the government does have a role in helping build the infrastructure here. Do you all agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, although I want to broaden your question just a little bit, because, I think that when we're talking about planning, I'm very proud of the fact that the United States and Canada are two of the closest nations in the world. And that could be an assumption that we make having broader application. We're trying to figure out what makes the most sense for a very important industry, but on a global basis. And as everyone knows, the world is in a terribly unsettled state right now. We were talking earlier about the Pacific Rim. Japan and Korea and China, tensions are extremely strained over there right now. And to get the governments, intergovernmental cooperation is much, much more difficult than, for example, the US and Canadian government representatives would be. And so to the extent that we try to take what we do in this part of the world and extend it to others, we need to take in cultural differences and just practical political tensions that exist throughout the world these days.
And I would agree, but I would just say that, yes, government should play a role, but just as we talked about who's in the North American auto industry, who's government? I think what we're seeing is some great experimentation on infrastructure in places like Quebec and California, and that's one of the good things about being in North America, is that it may not all be federally mandated. We may see some experimentation, and that's, I think, an exciting thing, because it gives us a chance to try things out on a manageable scale and take it further. So I think there's a real role for the states and provinces here that we may easily overlook.
Right.
Good point.
We have a question over here.
Quick question around zip cars and Hertz On Demand, and what your thoughts are as far as what that's going to do to the industry.
I think it's way cool, but I'm gonna.
Yeah, my daughter works for Zipcar, and it's a niche service. I think it's become a number of classes of consumers who have particular needs. There are people who don't want cars anymore, young who, what they want is a car on demand. I don't want to pay to park that darn thing every day for $45 a day. When I want to go, out to the suburbs to play hockey, I can go down the block and there'll be a car waiting for me. And when I'm done, I want to give it back. I don't want to pay insurance on it. I think that that's a good example of an entrepreneur saying, I see a need and I'm going to meet that need. Now the question is whether they can McDonaldize it successfully, and that's a big issue. But I think that it's a very innovative concept.
Well, and I would say it's an innovative concept for rental cars. I mean, this is really taking sort of the enterprise or budget model and saying, how do we take it to a neighborhood? How do we come up with rental periods that are shorter and an economic model that works? If we go to self-driving cars, which you mentioned earlier, then you have the idea of, well, can I use Uber or something and have a car pick me up, and instead of having to park it all day, it goes off and takes care of somebody else. So not only am I renting, but my rental period is even shorter and can be my daily commute. That there's a car waiting for me in the morning, almost like I'm a big shot or celebrity. The car takes me to work, the car goes, does something else.
Award-winning, after all.
I am award-winning after all, so maybe it'll be for me. So, but I think that takes it to another level, and we'll see whether. And then you don't even have to be the driver; it all takes care of itself. So that might be the next big thing.
What about the?
Yeah, we're running a little short on time, and there's a couple of more questions.
I just had a quick comment on
Okay,
this.
sure.
It's going to take 30 seconds. I think your question raises the whole, and even the panel we had today, the diversity of options. And I think in terms of customer choices, in terms of is it going to be electric, is it going to be, it's not diversity of supply, diversity of options, even of modes. I think some of the stuff Bob was talking about, especially for the freight sector and the high volume, is really very stimulating in terms of reflection and where we can go. So that's it's a traditional industry, some might say, but it's actually evolving in fascinating ways.
Great. Ross and then Laura.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about using CNG for fleet uses in the panel so far, and certainly, I work for GE. We have developed something we call CNG in a box, which you would take to the fleet operator and put behind his fence, and they would fuel up for all those kind of uses, like school buses or garbage trucks or taxis that go out and then they come home to roost at night. But there hasn't been much talk here in the panel about using LNG for long-haul transport, and I think that is something that there's a lot of interest out there, but there still seem to be some barriers around adoption. For example, I just saw that Shell canceled a liquefaction plant in Alberta, which was to be used for long-haul trucking from the Pacific coast out to the Manitoba border. There is a kind of green highway being built in the Detroit-Quebec City corridor. It should go all the way to the Atlantic with LNG infrastructure put in place. But it's hard to get the truckers to a couple of them are doing it and are converting. The same thing the railways are looking at, converting RG diesel locomotives to LNG. But again, there are regulatory hurdles around safety, around weight, around length of trucks, and it seems to me that we're kind of going into this a bit blind, and there's a huge need for harmonization of a regulatory approach to promote early adoption of both CNG and LNG. And I'm wondering if maybe Bob or the other panelists can comment on how do we make sure that, given the integration of the North American transportation system, that we actually have integrated regulations that can help support the early adoption of both CNG for fleets and LNG for long-haul trucking or rail or shipping.
So just on, let me give you my 30 seconds on LNG. LNG has struggled to gain traction in the way that CNG has, and at some level, I don't have a dog in this fight. I can build trucks that run on LNG or CNG. I just change the tank, so I don't care. But LNG is more expensive. It relies on the old oil company model of take a commodity, bring it to a central processing facility, ship it by truck to a station. It becomes a proprietary molecule, and so it starts to look a lot like gasoline. That's why I think traditional oil companies like the technology. The advantage that it has is it has significantly greater energy density than CNG. The disadvantage is more expensive, It is, when you're filling a vehicle with LNG, unsettling to say the least, as you have to wear a mask, you have to wear gloves, you have to wear, because you're doing a very low temperature fill. It's a fairly complex problem. So I think LNG struggled to get traction, especially given the new dual fuel option, which says I can blend diesel and CNG, which solves the distance problem that CNG had. So I think right now we've got two competing technologies for long-haul trucking, LNG versus a dual fuel CNG option. It's not obvious to me that LNG is going to win on this, and in fact I think LNG is going to struggle. I do think for very high horsepower applications like locomotives, and for applications like stationary power in remote locations, LNG will win. But it's struggling a little bit with just gaining market adoption because it's just a more expensive fuel.
And I don't want to sound too Schumpeterian. How's that for fancy? Schumpeterian. But there's a certain creative destruction out here, and I think a lot of times investors say, oh, if we could just get a government mandate, we could get the scale that would overcome our cost problems. And so I think sometimes that's the thing. If we just get the politicians in, and sometimes the politicians mean well and say, okay, let's mandate the technology and let's build a bunch of stations, let's enable this new world, maybe ahead of where the market might decide that was viable. So as messy as it is, I'd love to see everybody duke it out, and even if that means a lot of wasted technology by the side of the road, creatively destroyed, I think that's still better for us than making a bet on a technology that hasn't proven itself.
I agree, and I think that while you certainly didn't suggest this, people who are against regulatory harmonization describe it as a race to the bottom and compromising safety and all other important considerations, and that is simply not true. But if we don't go through the sort of creative destruction and take this one step at a time, dotting our I's and crossing our T's from a safety standpoint, then the whole trend can take a giant step backward, if the unthinkable occurs. And so this has to be viewed as a longer continuum, more than just this year's idea. I think it's going to be really more this decade or beyond's idea.
So I think we have time for one more question, and Dr. Dawson is the lucky winner.
Dr. Dawson, can I take your pulse? My work focuses on supply chain efficiency and the relationship with trade agreements and regulatory agreements. And what I see in the auto sector is a disjunction in many cases between the interests of big auto and the interests of small, innovative auto supply companies. For example, in trade agreements, in the recent Canada-Korea free trade agreement, small auto suppliers and related companies can really benefit from those kinds of open markets, and big auto is saying, ooh, we don't want to have those Korean imports, even though Canada doesn't export cars to Korea. Nevertheless, my question for you is, are the big companies, are the OEMs, are they championing innovation in ways that smaller companies can get on board and benefit from? Or are they impediments to innovation, and are they trying to direct the future of auto sector innovation in sort of their own image rather than the Schumpeterian creative destruction that Dr. Sands advocates?
Let me say a good thing and a bad thing about our traditional big companies. A good thing, they're naturally conservative. Because you have to line up so much money to build cars, you have to have the raw materials, the workforce, the dealership network, the engineers, all of this, before you get a car off the line, and you only make money when the car's off the line, they're conservative, they're risk averse. They don't want to produce another Edsel. So their view on innovation is, will it sell with consumers? And no matter how much pressure you get from the outside to build something that might please some small niche market, they tend to be a little, cherry about innovation. Be careful, make sure that it's an innovation that'll sell. And I think that's a virtue, even though it may seem to the impatient that it takes too long to get an innovation on the road. One of the weaknesses, though, that comes with the big auto companies is because they are big and they rely on volume, they can spread compliance costs for regulation across a very large number of units. So we saw this with the border, and a lot of the folks here at CUSLI know that on border, things like CT-PAT and FAST, the programs for managing things, are great for GM because they can figure out how to do supply chain security across a large number and absorb the cost and pass it on to the consumer. But it really hurts small suppliers because they can't do all this paperwork and file all this data and keep DHS happy. So I think you have a plus and a minus with the big companies, and it would be great if by liberalization of some of the rules and regulations, we could create a more level playing field that took advantage of letting companies decide when technology is ready for consumers and respects that wisdom, but also doesn't really just focus on things that the big companies can afford to bear the cost of.
And this means that Tesla can sell cars directly to consumers in New Jersey.
Or through Costco.
Yeah, or through Costco.
I mean, I think that's, from my experience would be that that's an optimistic view of the auto manufacturers. I think they actively
He is from Detroit, after all.
They actively use their power in the market to discourage and prevent innovation on their platforms. That's certainly been our experience in the natural gas business. The lever that they use is the warranty, because it's their most powerful lever with consumers. And so, for example, you can buy, and I'll pick on General Motors today, you can buy a General Motors CNG 6.0 liter Silverado with a particular tank configuration because GM has done a deal with IMCO to do that on a ship-through basis. But you cannot buy that exact same IMCO system on the exact same engine with that's got a different configuration than is available through the GM ship-through channel, even though it's technically identical, without putting your warranty at risk. Why? Because GM wants to control that market. And so, and I could give you examples out the wazoo of this, where what we're seeing is that the auto manufacturers are using their warranty power to discourage any aftermarket activity. And it really does limit innovation outside the platform. Now, I think they have an economic interest in doing that, and it's very clear that if you want a CNG vehicle, they want you to buy a new CNG vehicle. The last thing they want you to do is fix your 2012 Tahoe, because then you'll keep it for maybe 23 years instead of 22. But from a policy perspective, it's terrible policy.
Great.
And on the flip side, if you look through the other end of the telescope, Korea, in its economic development, essentially promoted the concept of sort of government-sanctioned monopolies called chaebols. And so the very super large companies, Samsung, LG, Hyundai, et cetera, dominate the local market, the domestic market. The free trade agreements have effectively been opportunities for small and medium-sized businesses, because the chaebols aren't giving up, their territory. Go elsewhere. We'll help you to go into other markets, and perhaps you might grow, and someday you may be like us, maybe not. But so in a sense, it's just the opposite from that standpoint. So free trade agreements are quite interesting in that, like humans, I mean, nations enter into them for a whole variety of different reasons.
Great. So please give an energetic thanks to our
thank you very much, panelists, and to Eric Miller, and to all the other chairs for the conference, Laura Dawson, Ross Hornby, Stephen DeBoer, who are in this room, Erica Young, who I know is around the corner watching and just outside. In particular, I'm not sure if folks know, I found out after I asked Eric Miller and Erica Young, who are connected as spouses, about halfway through planning, that they had a newborn on their hands, which I've been told is somewhat difficult to work with. So I'm grateful that they didn't bail on me. In fact, they did an excellent job. And so I'd like to give Eric and Erica a little gift from the Institute. I will put in the motion at our next meeting for to make her an honorary member, the new little one. So, as one last housekeeping matter before I pass the podium over to our co-chairs for final remarks, I just wanted to say thank you to our volunteer photographer, Linda Doctor, who last year did an amazing job covering our conference. All of you probably saw the photos, and I'm very excited to see this year's, which we will promptly put up on our social media pages. So if you haven't yet started following us, check us out on Facebook and also Twitter. And on the flip side, we want to see your photos, so please do send those. I've seen a number of them. They've been great, and we look forward to seeing those. So at this point, I'd like to pass the podium over to our co-chair, Jim Blanchard.
David, thank you very much. Since this is my country, I get to go first. This was a great panel. Thank you. And to all of you for being here. We weren't sure on a Saturday morning how many people would even get out of bed here after last night. But we're delighted you're here, all of the participants. I want to have a special thanks to Davis Robinson, because I didn't acknowledge him last night, even though you made that nice introduction. But he recruited our two keynoters for our program here, the opening keynote and last night. And those were very special speeches and addresses. And I want to thank you so much for serving on our board and doing that kind of work. Thank you. I want to thank my law partner, Rick Newcomb, who got me more involved in Cooley and continues on behalf of our law firm to be a very strong supporter. Thank you. He's a very humble but brilliant lawyer, and it's delightful to have you as a partner and most especially a friend. Thank you. Then to our two deans, they're not here now, but Ian Scott, Michael Scharf, we really appreciate their leadership. Kai Carmody is still here. Thank you for your directorship and your hard work, to all of you. Let me now also, where's David? We hope to see you back next year as a guest or a participant from the wonderful town of San Francisco. By the way, you said that Eric and his, you said they're connected. See, did you mean married? You said connected by spouse, whatever that was. I thought that was kind of a new age phrase. Married. Anyway. Legally. That's good too. But Eric, again, it's always a pleasure to work with you, and you did a great job with this staff. Now let me turn this over to my distinguished co-chair, the former trade minister, member of parliament, dear friend, Jim Peterson, for an afternoon.
As the guest in your great country, I get to go last. Unlike Rick Newcomb, I've never been referred to as humble or brilliant. I want to thank my co-chair, Jimmy, who's given such great leadership to this. We had another great panel today. You put together a wonderful, wonderful session for us of very informed, brilliant, articulate panelists who have been very informative. I have learned a great deal. I get the sense leaving here that there's an enthusiasm and rejuvenation that's taking place in Cooley, and that we will go on next year to bigger and better things. We are so grateful to every one of you for all you have given. We want you back with us for years to come. Thank you.